Hello, welcome, reconsider. So today I want to sort of do a follow-up on the previous video for the Illuminati stroke Cabal banker called Robert Bernard. This is the sort of second installment of the series. It looks like they're going to have about 5 or 6 more. I've already kind of done a running commentary on the first one, which kind of exposed some pretty disturbing details to do with financial elite and their kind of links to being actually the kind of the cabal, some of their religious beliefs as well, and just kind of very strange rituals, and also horrifically sort of child sacrifice as well. Not a very nice kind of level of detail really there, but the pretty much the financial system is very much like fixed to benefit the elite and sort of everyday people, essentially kind of slaves in this kind of money system. This second part that they released quite a while ago now, actually, it kind of goes through actually how the financial system kind of operates. So it kind of really gets into the mechanisms that they use to sort of suppress the general population and keep them where they are, keep the poor poorer and keep the rich richer. The pyramid that he kind of talks about, he starts to detail the various sort of layers, and at the very, very top is the BIS, which is the Bank of International Settlement. Pretty much is the very top of the pyramid, and he sort of claims this is the sort of institution that these top 8,000 to 8,500 people use to pretty much control the financial system worldwide generally. And then the next layer is the World Bank and also the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And then the third layer, there's the central banks. So this is the Federal Reserves and the Bank of England, all the kind of the supposed like national banks that kind of link to various kind of countries. And then the sort of fourth layer is all the regular banks, so your HSBCs and your Santanders. And then the fifth layer, he talks about it being the stock market centres. So you've got London, kind of New York, sort of Tokyo. They inhabit the sort of layer 5. And then the sixth layer is your multinationals and corporations. Now, then below that is actually the government. And that's quite sort of worrying, because you kind of start to sort of see that how kind of democracy is very much quite far down the pyramid. And so there's a lot of kind of levels above where, really the kind of normal people don't really get a say. And then below government, there's the kind of the enforcers of all this kind of policy and all these institutions, and they're the armies, the police force, and the civil officers. And then the very bottom of the pyramid is, the real world, real life, where, we all inhabit our jobs, our families. That's kind of the very bottom layer. And that's how kind of Bernard pretty much structures the whole financial system in his eyes anyway. And he sort of talks about how all the value is held at the bottom of the pyramid, and they use all these institutions and kind of various mechanisms to extract value from that bottom layer and then send it up to the top. Now, again, as I mentioned, the Bank of International Settlement is very much at the top. And again, it's controlled by the 8,500 potential sort of cabal elite. And their orders pretty much are sort of filtered down through the system. Now, the Bank of International Settlement, the BIS, is based in Switzerland in Basel. And then it actually was started in the 1930s and stems from the Netherlands, and is pretty much the headquarters of the financial world, and is, again, strangely, is completely independent from Switzerland, where it is based now, and is above all world rules, and also it potentially is actually an independent state in its own right and has complete immunity and even has its own police force. And also the employees actually work there also have immunity from most laws. And all of this detail is not kind of secret, it's actually kind of detailed actually on their website as well. That's what Robert talks about. He sort of claims that the BIS manipulates the kind of the gold markets on frequently, so they can add or take value away. And so again, they have kind of complete control of this, and the sort of the history and the control of the BIS sort of like harks all the way back to kind of World War II, when the Allies and also the Nazis would be meeting at the BIS. and they would be trading stolen gold, pretty much a lot of the time stolen from kind of Jewish families, but then also kind of invaded states. And he sort of goes on to talk about how the BIS and the system again keeps the rich richer and maintains the poor to, stay poor. And the BIS, pretty much all the central banks like the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England, they all belong to the BIS. They all have to follow, the rules that they specify. Now, this kind of strange situation when you have these institutions and they're essentially on kind of their own sort of sovereign land is a common theme, and so it affects the City of London, which is one of the largest financial centres. Again, they're their own sort of free territory with their own police force. The same with the Vatican, and he was even saying that even areas of Washington DC are also independent kind of free states. And it's just very strange that it makes you think when you start to kind of learn all this, and it's not hidden information, it's all there if you want to know about it. But how the mainstream media or academia never kind of talk about this, and how this is strange, and how these kind of really huge, influential, kind of dominating institutions like can have this immunity and really just work above global kind of law frameworks, and that is never really highlighted at all. And I find that quite astounding, because we all are affected by it. So I just find it very strange that it's never really reported that often at all. Now, he also goes to talk about the ESM, which is the European Stability Mechanism. Again, that was kind of it was designed by the BIS, and it enables the European banks to remain stable. And again, this institution, its employees have immunity, and a lot of the records and the operations of the ESM are kind of kept secret, and they're not generally publicly available. Now, the power of the ESM is quite incredible. It can actually sort of demand money from banks and sorry, not banks, from countries, and they generally have like 7 days to pay. So, they could demand sort of 10 billion from Greece or Italy, and then that country would have, 7 days to pay it, without question. So that's an extraordinary amount of power, and again, also very strange. He then goes to sort of briefly touch upon kind of Greece and how, Greece was given a huge loan to bail it out from a financial crisis. And it's a loan generally that Greece can never really pay, and it's just saddled them a huge amount of debt. And all the kind of interest and the debt loan payments, they all pretty much go to German, Dutch, and French banks. Now, a lot of the sort of country stocks of Greece were essentially dumped, and then a lot of the taxes from other countries around the European Union were then used to pay for it. So, Greece's sort of unfortunate situation of being saddled with so much debt is then like carried by other European countries. So he kind of briefly touches upon that, which again in itself is kind of quite shocking. But then on a more sort of international level, he sort of talks about the IMF, and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is supposed to help countries, especially developing countries. But in actual fact, again, it generally kind of creates debt for countries that could never really pay back. So Bernard claims that the International Monetary Fund is helped by multinationals who go into these particular developing countries, and again they extract value, and this is allowed to happen by essentially buying off the various country elites through bribes, but then also kind of blackmail, kind of obviously finding them in compromising situations, like having evidence on that so they can leverage that as to work to their benefit, but then also more disturbingly, using actually kind of child trafficking as well. So that's incredibly disturbing. But you still getting all these kind of like processes they use to sort of, leverage their way into a country to kind of extract value. And, potentially the IMF is supposed to really help sort of countries in development, but in a lot of ways, again, it just extorts value and just creates kind of misery sometimes. He sort of harks back to the bottom of the pyramid really having the real value at the bottom, where the people are, the normal people who work. And how is that value extracted? And it's very simple. It's essentially interest, the interest rate. The interest that like just seems very benign and very kind of normal, actually is the sort of main mechanism they use to kind of extract value. And it basically kind of creates debt. A normal person, you go into a bank and you ask for a loan, and they essentially just create money out of thin air. And it's not linked to anything. It's not linked to gold. It's not linked to kind of like material. It's like literally digits in a computer system that are just created, and then they charge you, potentially 5% interest for the privilege. Now he sort of says that, over a span of about 20 years, that 5% interest will then essentially wipe out any value that existed. And he was just sort of saying actually how that interest is the key. That is how they extract kind of value, and they sort of create this kind of debt, and that interest is then sent up straight to the top of the pyramid. Now it just kind of creates, like as you can tell at the moment, is where it's just debt like plastered on top of debt, and that's what happens. So they just create more and more elastoplast, like band-aids. They just create more debt contracts on top of debt contracts. And it's this interest that kind of creates like a situation of like shortage, and actually creates too much competition. And also, he says, misery in society, because it extorts value and sends it up the chain, and leaves nothing at the bottom of the pyramid. This kind of like is why you get such huge national debts like all around the world, and again is used as a system of control to prevent people from rising up to the top. And he's just amazed about how ignorant they are, that they are being essentially kind of stolen from. And again, this interest, it kind of creates, you think it's a normal way in the modern world that things are, but actual fact, it creates like a rat race, and it creates kind of competition, and it creates scarcity. It's kind of does the complete opposite. And he was just sort of saying, if, an interest rises by 1.8%, it essentially means that your salary for your job is worth 1.8% less money. So money is always being depreciated. Back in like the 50s and 60s, potentially in the Western world, you could have one sort of person working, and that was enough to able to kind of support the entire household, the whole family. And now you've got the sort of situation where you've got two people working long hours, and struggling really to afford to make things, to make ends meet. So that is kind of the situation we find ourselves, because you've had decades of essentially kind of currency being devalued, and this interest just sucking out all the kind of value out to do with it. He talks about how like 80% of the kind of the world population pay all the kind of interest, and then sort of 10% pay some interest, but they also receive some interest back. And it's the kind of the final sort of 10% is they pretty much receive all the interest. And he sort of goes back kind of historically about, concerning interest, like how we accept this kind of scenario, this situation, this sort of system, and how when, the Catholics used to rule across Europe, in actual fact, like interest was completely illegal. And if you tried to implement it, it was actually punishable by death. And how the Islamic banking system was one of the last kind of institutions to actually use, to actually stay away from interest. They have kind of adopted it now, but they were one of the last few banking systems to sort of stay away from that. So in summary, he's basically saying, majority of the world population pays into this system, of interest. And it's a small select few, this 8,000 who control the bank of settlements, who pretty much they take all the interest, they take all the value. And that is kind of the situation right now. And that is why, kind of the financial system is such a kind of volatile state. But kind of in summary, he sort of talks about how this system is a breeding ground, essentially, kind of for psychopaths, because you have all these large institutions with, free states with complete immunity above all world laws, and so it allows them to sort of work. It allows them to operate without any kind of repercussions, and it's the perfect breeding ground for kind of psychopaths, essentially. And it just, again, maintains the poorer being poorer and the rich being richer, and how, their business models are based on sort of misery. And he talks about how war is a business model, how kind of bad pharmaceuticals are a business model, and how, the system is maintained by sort of mainstream politicians. And he sort of says how, career politicians, obviously they have a particular career trajectory they want to head for, and so they never question the system, because if they did, obviously then they'd be left behind. And so it's all kind of self-serving. So this is why this is never ever addressed. Do you know what I mean? They're just constantly, maintaining this system. Robert sort of goes on to sort of say that him and his team now, part of his kind of his business now, is actually about educating people. And I think he does kind of lecture tours, again, him and his team, around sort of Belgium and also the Netherlands, just explaining to people how the system actually works and how it operates in his kind of experiences. So, information is key. And again, this sort of information really isn't being, strangely, being discussed in the mainstream. Thank you very much for joining me. Take care. Bye bye.